was your first response to the assassination attempt of Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords? Mine was shock. I felt horrified and confused. When thinking of the victims, my belly ached with grief. When thinking of the shooter, a plea erupted from the depths of my gut. Please don't be a Latino. The last thing Arizona needs right now is a Mexican-American killing a representative of Congress. I then thought, please don't be an undocumented person. The last thing Arizona needs right now is a stereotype that illegals are criminals to be feared, to be eliminated. My imagination ran wild. I began to play a game called What If? What if a Mexican citizen had crossed the border an hour and a half south of Tucson and attempted the assassination of a member of Congress? Would state and federal officials agree to increase border control? Would the feds concede to Arizona's desire to, as articulated in SB 1070, require immigrants to keep registration documents in their possession at all times? Would there be a crackdown on those who shelter, hire, or transport undocumented persons? Would there be an increase in racial profiling? Would there be an increase in hate crimes against Latinos, just as the hate crimes against Arabs increased by 1,700% in the 3 months after September 11th? When thinking of the shooter, my internalized cry continued, please don't be an Arab. The last thing our country needs is to fan the stereotype that all Muslims are terrorists. What if the shooter was Arab? Would he be labeled as one born of a silent terrorist cell? Would there be bricks thrown into mosques? Would there be mass burnings of Qurans? Would a new Patriot Act be passed by Congress, thereby permitting more wires to be tapped and detainees to be held? My imagination ran amok. Then the facts grounded me. He was a white, male, 22-year-old citizen of the United States. He did not have any religious affiliation other than his target being a representative of Congress. It was not clear that he was politically motivated, meaning he was not working on behalf of an extremist group. He was a deranged individual who suffered from mental illness. These facts began to fuel my difficult emotions. I said to myself, isn't it typical that his race was rarely mentioned? What does this say about white privilege? The origin of this question derived from the subject of my original sermon entitled, Does Race Matter? I had been thinking a lot about race and said to myself, why yes, even in a so-called colorblind society, race does matter when whites as a race are not implicated because of the actions of an individual who is white. Whereas Arabs in general are often implicated because of the actions of a few religious extremists. I began to post my thoughts on Facebook, and my colleague Ian asked another question. What if a Muslim politician had published a map of the U.S. with crosshairs targeting the particular Congress women and men? He was right to ask this question. White privilege means that you can say and do anything without any consequences. I became troubled by the double standard and felt angry at the lack of remorse shown by Sarah Palin for her violent rhetoric. I received email from friends and family who, like me, wanted to blame Palin and the Tea Party and the NRA contributing to Loughner's actions. I was in a state of righteousness, ready to defend my ideology. Then another question was posed. What if the shooter, what if his name was Muhammad? The question came from talk show host Rush Limbaugh, and he made this point. Conservative pundits and conservative politicians cannot be blamed for Loughner's actions any more than Muslims on a whole can be blamed for the terrorist acts of a few. His point made me take pause. It's hard to admit that Rush Limbaugh made me take a moral pause. I was feeling troubled. I was feeling troubled by the complexity of these ideas, and I approached my colleague, Jeff Frankel, who is in his second week of serving as the communications director. He asked me some very powerful questions, like, was it appropriate to conflate this tragedy with the subject of race? Aren't they both worthy of their own talks? He asked, is it the right timing and the context to address race relations, or would it be best explored after we all had some distance from the trauma? We discussed the sensitive nature of the event and the sensational nature of my polemic question that asked, what if Loughner were Mexican? We asked ourselves if it would be perceived as opportunistic of me to take a national tragedy and pontificate about speculative conjectures. Was it appropriate to politicize an event that needed less politics and more humanity? We recognized the need for a compassionate message, and yet contemplated whether the sermon title would be akin to professional marketing strategies. Often, the media uses the 5 C's to sell news. Every story needs controversy, conflict, contradiction, colorful language, and a cast of characters. And boy, did my question fit that. And yet, Jeff gently yet directly helped me ponder whether the methods of modern media were appropriate for a sermon. This led me to recognize that white privilege was not the subject of today's talk. The true subject had become the polemic nature of our political discourse, of which we are all a part. Why was my first impulse to blame? Why was my first reaction to this tragedy to shame? Why was my intention to speak more from the head than from the heart? I want to thank you, Jeff, for having the courage to engage me in this uncomfortable realization. I have been moved by the moral depth of your question, which reminds me why we hired you. The search committee agreed that you would be more than a director of communications, but a minister of communications, ministering to the minister. You have already proven yourself worthy of such a title. Thank you. Later in the week, President Barack Obama delivered the sermon Jeff wanted me to write. As pastor-in-chief, he called us to pause for a moment and make sure that we're talking with each other in a way that heals, not in a way that wounds. Ironically, this same message was sent to me via email by Jenny Stiles, who earlier this week watched me argue with someone who's very dear to me. As co-chair of the ministry leadership team, she said, "You make good arguments and you prove your points well. My suggestion, though, is this. Act in a way you think will do the most to heal the situation, not win the argument." She said, "We are all flawed people, and our actions come from broken places much of the time. Taking a stance that is adversarial and defensive will not help the parties involved move beyond where they are. The urban monk does not prove a point or win an argument. He is calm and confident, a vehicle through which divine compassion flows always. You rock." I do not always feel that it's possible for me to morally rock the house. I don't always feel the strength to be a spiritually mature urban monk. I often lose sight of what is right in the pursuit of trying to be right. I often have thoughts that contribute to what Barack calls the usual plane of politics and point scoring and pettiness. I may not be the only one who struggles to have good form. We often feel enraged by injustices and have the impulse to stand up and speak out. We want to channel our grief, our anger by asking, why have gun sales in Arizona increased by 60% in the last week? We want to scream, no, you cannot, under any circumstances, put a bullseye icon on your political opponent. And no, this image may not have caused this young man to attempt an assassination, but this icon is distasteful, divisive, and inappropriate. We want to use what little moral authority that has been invested in us and publicly discipline those whose actions are morally repulsive. We know we are right, and we want to rub it in the flawed person's face. But what happens when we are just as flawed? Those of us on the left may not want to listen to the wisdom of Rush Limbaugh, let alone admit that he might have something of value to say. Those of us on the right don't want to admit that it was a Latino man named Hernandez who heroically tended to Congresswoman Giffords, let alone admit that his identity is of value to our collective American story. We don't always have the patience to see the other side because our first impulse is to arm ourselves with mirrors we intend to point forward without first looking into the mirror ourselves. We don't always want to talk pretty. We don't always want to practice deep listening and loving speech, because sometimes we feel the most just response is to throw our hands down and cry, enough. We know ourselves when we are in this state. We are not calm, but pretend to be. We are not confident, but pretend to be. We are not persuasive, but pretend to be. We know screaming is not going to solve things. We know anger is a signal and not a solution. We know that persuasion is a craft and is mastered by practicing good form, dear chap. But the truth is, our strength often wanes. We don't always have kind thoughts or are willing to see beyond our own perspectives. It's easy for us to become impatient in the midst of dualistic political discourse. We feel the urge to retreat from the world only to find that our conscience propels us back into playing the role of the bridge. Be the bridge, we're told. Be the bridge. That's when exhaustion sets in. It's hard to play the middle. We get tired of mediating everyone's points of view, as best expressed by Donna Kate Rushin, an African-American poet who says, "I've had enough. I'm sick of seeing and touching both sides of things. Sick of being the damn bridge for everybody. Nobody can talk to anybody without me, right? I explain my mother to my father to my little sister to my brother to the white feminists to the black church folks to the ex-hippies to the black separatists to the artists to the parents of my friends. I've got to explain myself to everybody. I do more translating than the UN. Forget it. I'm sick of filling in your gaps. Sick of being your insurance against the isolation of your self-imposed limitations. Sick of being the crazy at your holiday dinners, the odd one at your Sunday brunches. I'm sick of being the sole black friend to 34 individual white folks. Find another connection to the rest of the world. Something else to make you legitimate. Some other way to be political and hip. I will not be the bridge to your womanhood, your manness, your humanness. I'm sick of reminding you not to close off too tight for too long. Sick of mediating with your worst self on behalf of your better selves. Sick of having to remind you to breathe before you suffocate your own full self. Forget it. Stretch or drown. Evolve or die. You see, it's like this. The bridge I must be is the bridge to my own power. I must translate my own fears, mediate my own weaknesses. I must be the bridge to nowhere but my own true self. It's only then I can be useful. That's all we've ever wanted, to be of use. We want to be true to ourselves, and that's what we do here week after week. We mediate our own weaknesses. We come before one another to lay it all down and say, hi, I want to introduce you to my true and gritty self. And that's where it gets messy. We participate in that messy thing called America, trapped in a seemingly eternal state of moral immaturity. It's like we're a teenage mutant nation with pimples on our pride that feed our collective insecurities. We're defensive and reactionary and bitchy and poised to either banish or to flee. We are a young, idealist nation, awkwardly learning from the failures of racism and brutality and bigotry. We are fumbling to learn from the failures and thinking sensationalism is news, whereas sensationalism is a good sermon. And violent rhetoric is motivating. We are imperfectly learning to be just, to be kind, to be fair, to be good, and frankly, we struggle with being good even with ourselves, just like our country struggles to be good to us. As participants in this clumsy and blemished democracy, we struggle to be made whole. We as one nation, as troubled, we come, for as calm we long to be. We are righteous and we are meek. We are unassuming yet bold. We are confused and centered. We are peaceful and pissed. We are fair and bigoted. We are unbridled and controlled. We are one big contradiction. We are the compassionate conservatives and the liberal fundamentalists. We are the right-wingers and the moderate centrists. We are the party of no and the promoters of that radical gay agenda. We are one big contradiction of hopes and fears, of laughter and tears. We are America, longing to be set free from the prisons of our own making. We have a dream, born of prejudice and violence, lived with hope and persistence. We have a dream of suffering, born of suffering, of injustice, and lived with courage and tenacity. But just as the architect relies on contractors to build a home, so do the architects of the Constitution call us each day to construct a society where there will be liberty and justice for all. Amen. There will be days when you come to your own country, just like you come to church, longing for a message of comfort and of peace. And just like there will be days when my sermons will fail you, so will leaders of our country fail us all. And that's why we must not only rely on the lone voice of the public official or the pundit or the clergyman to deliver us from evil. It is your civic responsibility to find your own voice and to ask yourself each and every day, how will your words, your deeds contribute to the common good? To take up this charge, begin by playing a game called What If? What if you were to choose your words wisely and ask your questions carefully and act with intentionality? For each position you take, each move you make, will serve as a teacher to another. So just as the words of Ginny and Jeff have served as my sacred text today, so your words can inspire another. You are more likely to emulate such thoughtfulness when you surround yourselves with those who have the courage and the determination to ground their words, their deeds, in the moral imagination. But what if? What if there comes a time when you get tired and, like me, don't have the strength to speak with good form? That's when you challenge yourself to find the means to heal the situation, not win the argument. Let your healing words become like a warm ocean current, wearing down the edges of the rocky cliff. Let your healing actions serve as the rising tide of spiritual maturity, inspiring us all to higher